The scream that tore through the Arizona twilight in 1876 was enough to make even the rattlesnakes pause, and Kade Quinlan had been tracking those sounds for the better part of an hour, his horse picking through the rocky terrain south of Evanston with practiced care. He found her crumpled against a boulder, her dress torn and bloodied, one hand pressed against her face while the other clutched at her shoulder where fabric had been shredded away. The stagecoach wreckage lay scattered across the canyon floor below, still smoking from whatever had caused it to careen off the narrow mountain pass. Kade dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on loose stone as he approached with his hands visible, knowing a frightened woman could be just as dangerous as any outlaw. Her head snapped up at the sound, and even in the dimming light he could see the panic in her eyes, the way her whole body trembled like a cornered animal. Blood seeped between the fingers covering the left side of her face, dripping onto her already ruined traveling dress. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady. "I am not here to hurt you. Saw the smoke from the ridge. Are there others?" She shook her head violently, then winced at the movement. "Dead. They are all dead. The driver, the guard, the other passengers. The wheel broke and we just kept rolling and rolling." Her voice cracked on the last word, dissolving into a sob that shook her entire frame. Kade knelt a few feet away, giving her space while his experienced eyes assessed the situation. She was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and now hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her dress, though torn and stained, had once been fine quality, the kind a respectable young woman would wear for traveling. But it was the blood that concerned him most, still flowing steadily from whatever injury she was trying to hide. "I need to look at your wounds," he said gently. "You are losing blood, and out here, that is a death sentence once the sun goes down. Predators can smell it for miles." "No." The word came out sharp and panicked. "Do not look at me. Just leave me here. Let me die with some dignity left." Kade studied her for a long moment, taking in the desperation in her tone, the way she pressed herself harder against the boulder as if she could disappear into the stone itself. He had seen plenty of death in his 31 years, had watched good men bleed out on dusty streets and rocky ground, and he was not about to watch this young woman join them out of some misplaced sense of shame. "I have got water, bandages, and a camp about 3 miles north with shelter and a fire," he said, making his voice firm but not unkind. "I can leave you here to die if that is what you truly want, but I do not think it is. I think you are scared and hurt and do not know if you can trust a stranger." "That is fair. But I am going to tell you plain. I am not leaving you here alone, and if you want to live, you are going to have to let me help you." She was quiet for so long he thought she might refuse, might choose death over whatever fear had its claws in her. Then slowly, she lowered her hand from her face. The scars ran from her left temple down to her jaw, 4 parallel lines that looked like claw marks, old and healed but still angry and red against her pale skin. They pulled at her eyes slightly, giving her face an asymmetrical appearance that would draw stares in any town. But it was the fresh wound that concerned him more, a deep gash across her shoulder where something sharp had torn through skin and muscle, likely from the crash itself. "There," she said, her voice hollow. "Now you see. Now you know why I should have died with the others. Who wants to live looking like a monster?" Kade reached for his canteen without taking his eyes off her. "Those look like mountain lion scars, old ones, maybe 5 or 6 years." She blinked at him, clearly surprised by the clinical observation rather than the horror or pity she had been expecting. "A cougar attacked me when I was 17. My father shot it, but not before it did this." "Then you are a survivor," Kade said simply. He dampened a cloth and held it out to her, And this here is fresh, probably needs stitching. Can you ride? I do not understand. She took the cloth automatically, pressing it to her bleeding shoulder. You are not disgusted. You do not think I am ruined. Kade turned his head, showing her the left side of his face for the first time. 3 thick scars ran from his ear down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar, the tissue raised and rough. Grizzly bear, 4 years back, nearly took my head off. Got me from here, he touched his ear. All the way down to here, his hand moved to his chest. Clawed open half my torso. Took 6 months before I could work again. He watched understanding dawn in her eyes, watched the fear begin to ease just a fraction. She was staring at his scars the way people had no doubt stared at hers, but there was no horror in her gaze, only recognition. The recognition of someone who understood what it meant to carry visible proof of survival, of a moment when death had come calling and somehow been turned away. Then we match perfectly, he said softly, and something in those 4 words made her start crying again. But these tears seemed different, less desperate and more like a release. Her name was Jane Adelaide, and she told him the story in fragments as he worked on her shoulder by firelight, his needle pulling thread through torn skin with practiced efficiency. She barely flinched at the pain, too exhausted and emotionally drained to do more than answer his questions when he asked them. She had been traveling from Denver to Tucson, carrying letters of recommendation for a teaching position at a girls' school. Her father had died the previous winter, her mother 5 years before that, and she had no other family to speak of. The school did not know, she said quietly as Kade tied off the last stitch. About my face, I mean. I sent a photograph, but it was taken from my right side. I thought if I could just get there, if they could meet me first, maybe they would give me a chance despite the scarring. Why Tucson? Kade asked, cleaning his needle and returning it to his kit. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows across the small cave he had made camp in for the night. His horse stood nearby, and he had already seen to the animal's needs before turning his attention to his unexpected patient. Because it is far from Denver, where everyone knows me as that poor scarred Adelaide girl, where mothers pull their children away when I walk past and men look everywhere except at my face. The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut. I thought distance might give me a fresh start. I saved every penny from my seamstress work for 2 years to afford that stagecoach ticket. Kade wrapped a bandage around her shoulder, his hands gentle despite their size. The driver and guard, they did not suffer. The crash killed them quick. I found the wreckage before I found you, made sure before I came looking for survivors. Jane closed her eyes. There was another woman, older, traveling with her husband. They were kind to me on the journey, did not stare. I am sorry, Kade said, and meant it. He had seen too much death in his years working as a ranch hand and occasional scout, but it never got easier, never stopped hitting like a punch to the gut. They sat in silence for a while, the fire providing warmth against the desert night's chill. Kade had given Jane his bedroll and was content to rest against his saddle, his rifle within easy reach. He watched her struggle to stay awake, saw the moment exhaustion finally won out and her eyes drifted closed. He stayed awake, keeping watch as the stars wheeled overhead and the desert night sang its ancient song of crickets and distant coyotes. He thought about the fear in her eyes when she had first revealed her scars, the certainty that he would find her repulsive. He thought about his own scars, hidden mostly beneath clothing but no less real, and the way people's eyes would snag on the ones visible on his neck, their expressions shifting to curiosity or discomfort or pity. When dawn broke pink and gold across the Arizona sky, Kade had a decision made. He would take her to Evanston, get her properly looked after by the doctor there, and then help her figure out what came next. It was not much of a plan, but it was better than leaving her to make her own way through country that could be hostile to a lone woman, scarred or not. Jane woke slowly, confusion crossing her face before memory returned and her hand flew to her bandaged shoulder. She looked around the cave, then at Kade, who was already up and preparing coffee over the rekindled fire. "You are still here," she said, and there was something fragile in her voice that made Kade's chest tighten. "Where else would I be?" He handed her a tin cup of coffee, black and strong. "Figured we would head into Evanston once you have had something to eat. Doc Morrison can look at those stitches, make sure I did not mess them up too badly. Then we can wire Tucson, let them know about the accident." Jane took the coffee but did not drink it immediately. "Why are you helping me? You do not know me." "For all you know, I could be a criminal fleeing justice." Kade considered the question while he fried salt pork and hardtack in his pan. "Could ask you the same. For all you know, I could be the worst kind of outlaw, and here you are alone with me in the middle of nowhere." "But you are not," Jane said with certainty. "An outlaw would not have stitched my shoulder or given me his bedroll. An outlaw would not have checked on the dead or kept watch all night." She paused. "You did keep watch all night, didn't you? You look exhausted." "Sleep is overrated," Kade said with a slight smile, the expression pulling at his scars. He saw Jane's eyes track the movement, but there was no disgust there, only curiosity and something that might have been understanding. "And I am helping you because no one should be left alone in the desert to die, and because I know what it is like to carry scars and have people see them before they see you." He served her breakfast on a tin plate, and they ate in companionable silence as the desert came alive around them. Birds called from hidden perches, and in the distance, a herd of pronghorn moved across the scrubland like flowing water. It was beautiful in the harsh way the desert always was, unforgiving but honest. The ride to Evanston took most of the day, with Jane sitting behind Kade on his bay gelding, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. She was quiet for long stretches, lost in her own thoughts, but occasionally she would ask him questions. Where was he from? New Mexico originally, though he had been drifting for the better part of a decade. What did he do? Ranch work mostly, sometimes scouting for the army or guiding hunting parties. Did he have family? A brother somewhere in California, but they had not spoken in years. Jane shared pieces of her own story in return. Her childhood in a small town outside Denver, her mother's death from pneumonia, her father's slow descent into drink after losing his wife. The cougar attack that had happened when she was helping her father check trap lines in the mountains. The weeks of fever and pain that followed, the way people's attitudes toward her had changed overnight. She had gone from being a pretty girl with prospects to being someone to be pitied or avoided, depending on the person. "I used to love looking in mirrors," she said at one point, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "I was vain, I suppose, always making sure my hair was perfect or my dress was pressed just right. After the attack, I could not stand my own reflection. I covered every mirror in our house with cloth. My father thought I was being dramatic, but he was too deep in his grief and his bottle to really care." Kade felt her arms tighten slightly around his waist, felt the way she was using him as an anchor against memories that still had the power to hurt. "What changed?" he asked. "Nothing changed. I just learned to live with it. I kept my hair long so I could hide behind it. I learned to turn my face just so in conversations. I became invisible in all the ways that mattered." She was quiet for a moment. "When my father died, part of me was relieved. Guilty for feeling relieved, but relieved nonetheless. It meant I could leave, could try to start over somewhere no one knew me. Tucson still seems like an option," Cade said. They will hear about the accident eventually, but there is no reason you could not still take that teaching position if they offer it. Maybe. Jane did not sound convinced. Or maybe it is a sign that I should stop running and face the fact that my face is going to define me no matter where I go. Your face does not define you, Cade said firmly. It is just one part of who you are. Anyone who cannot see past it is not worth your time. He felt Jane's laugh, soft and sad against his back. Easy to say, harder to believe when you have spent years being treated like a ghost. They reached Evanston, as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the town in shades of amber and gold. It was not a large town, maybe 500 people at most, but it had the essential services: a general store, a saloon, a church, a doctor's office, and a small hotel. Cade guided his horse directly to the doctor's office, helping Jane dismount with careful hands on her waist. Doc Morrison was a gruff man in his 60s with kind eyes and steady hands. He examined Jane's shoulder with professional detachment, making approving noises at Cade's stitchwork. "You have done this before," he said, not making it a question. "Enough times," Cade confirmed. "Mostly on myself or horses." "Well, you did a fine job. Miss, you are lucky he found you. Another few hours and infection could have set in." Doc Morrison cleaned the wound again and applied fresh bandages. "You will want to keep this clean and dry for the next week at least. Come back in 3 days and I will check it again." While the doctor worked, Cade stepped outside to make arrangements. He spoke with the hotel owner about a room for Jane, paid for a week in advance despite her protests when he told her later. He visited the telegraph office and sent a wire to the school in Tucson, explaining about the accident and asking about the position. Then he went to the general store and purchased Jane some basic necessities: a simple dress, undergarments, toiletries, and a warm shawl for the cold desert nights. When he returned to the doctor's office, Jane was dressed in her cleaned and mended traveling dress, though it still bore the stains of blood and dirt. Her face was pale, and she was leaning heavily on the examination table. "The room is ready whenever you are," Cade said, showing her the packages from the general store. "I took a guess at sizes. Sarah at the store said they could exchange anything that does not fit." Jane stared at the packages, then at him, and for a moment he thought she might cry again. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "You have done too much already. I cannot accept charity." "It is not charity," Cade said. "It is basic human decency. You lost everything in that crash. Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better. You can pay me back when you are settled in your teaching job." "If I get the job," Jane corrected, but she took the packages with trembling hands. "Thank you, Mr. Quinlan. I do not know how I will ever repay your kindness." "Cade," he said. "Just Cade, and there is nothing to repay. Come on, let me walk you to the hotel." The hotel was small but clean, and the owner's wife, a motherly woman named Clara, took one look at Jane and immediately began fussing over her like a hen with one chick. Cade left Jane in capable hands, promising to check on her in the morning, and then made his way to the saloon for a much-needed drink and a meal. The saloon was busy, but not rowdy, filled with tired men finishing their workday with whiskey and conversation. Cade found a table in the back corner and ordered stew and beer, letting the familiar sounds of the saloon wash over him. He was exhausted, running on coffee and determination, but his mind would not settle. He kept seeing Jane's face when she had first lowered her hand, the fear and shame in her eyes, the certainty that he would reject her because of scars that told a story of survival. He understood that fear more intimately than he cared to admit. His own scars had cost him opportunities, had seen him turned away from jobs and social events, had made mothers pull their daughters close when he walked past. People saw the scars and made assumptions that he was dangerous, careless, or cursed with bad luck. They did not see the man underneath, did not want to hear the story of how he had saved a child from a charging grizzly and nearly died in the process. "You look like a man with the weight of the world on his shoulders," a voice said, and Kade looked up to find the saloon owner, a weathered man named Pete, standing beside his table. "Heard you brought in a survivor from that stagecoach crash. Hell of a thing." "Hell of a thing," Kade agreed, taking a long drink of his beer. Pete pulled out a chair and sat down without invitation. "Also heard you paid for her hotel room and bought her supplies. That is generous of you, stranger. We do not get many men through here willing to help a woman in distress without expecting something in return." There was no accusation in Pete's voice, just curiosity, but Kade felt his jaw tighten anyway. "She needed help. I was in a position to give it. That is all there is to it." "Fair enough." Pete studied him for a moment. "You looking for work? I could use another hand behind the bar, and you look like a man who can handle himself if things get rowdy." Kade considered the offer. He had been planning to move on after delivering Jane safely to town, had no real ties keeping him in Evanston. But the thought of leaving her here alone, still recovering and vulnerable, sat wrong in his gut. "I might be," he said slowly. "Let me think on it." Pete nodded and stood. "Offer stands. Good men are hard to find out here." He walked away, leaving Kade to his thoughts and his rapidly cooling stew. Kade spent the night in the livery stable with his horse, unwilling to spend money on his own room when hay and a saddle made for a perfectly adequate bed. He was up before dawn, as was his habit, and spent the early morning hours helping the livery owner with feeding and watering the horses in exchange for his night's lodging. The work was familiar and soothing, requiring just enough attention to keep his hands busy while his mind wandered. He was thinking about Jane, about the way her eyes had changed when she looked at his scars, the recognition and relief that had flooded her features. He was thinking about the softness of her voice when she thanked him, the strength in her spine despite everything she had been through. He was thinking about how, for the first time in years, someone had looked at him and seen past the damage to the man underneath. When the sun was high enough to constitute a reasonable visiting hour, Kade made his way to the hotel. Clara answered his knock with a warm smile. "She is in the dining room having breakfast. Go on in." Jane was sitting at a table by the window, dressed in the new blue calico dress he had purchased. Her hair was clean and braided, hanging over her left shoulder in a way that partially concealed her scars without completely hiding them. She looked up when he entered and something in her expression softened. "Good morning," she said. "Please sit. I was hoping you would come by." Kade took the seat across from her, accepting a cup of coffee from Clara with a nod of thanks. "How are you feeling?" "Sore, but better. Clara helped me wash up last night, and actual sleep in an actual bed did wonders." Jane wrapped her hands around her own coffee cup. "I received a response to the telegram this morning. The school in Tucson sends their condolences about the accident, but says the position has been filled by someone else. They wished me well in my future endeavors." The disappointment in her voice was palpable, and Kade felt anger flare in his chest on her behalf. "That is quick work, filling a position." "They did not want me," Jane said simply. "Someone must have wired ahead, described me perhaps, or maybe they just did not want to take a chance on someone who survived when others died. Bad luck and all that." She tried to smile, but it did not reach her eyes. "So now I am stuck in Evanston with no job, no prospects, and no way to repay your kindness." "Stop worrying about repaying me," Kade said, probably more sharply than he intended. He softened his tone. "You are not stuck. There are options." Clara mentioned the schoolteacher here just got married and moved to Prescott. The town has been looking for a replacement. It would not be a fancy girls' school, but it would be honest work. Jane's eyes widened. The town would never hire me. One look at my face and the parents would riot. Maybe. Or maybe they would see a qualified teacher who is willing to work hard and care about their children's education. Kade leaned forward. It is worth asking, is it not? What is the worst that could happen? They say no, and you are in the same position you are now. The worst that could happen is they say yes, and then the children have nightmares about their monster teacher, Jane said bitterly. I have experience with children, Kade. They are not known for their tact or kindness. Some children are cruel, some adults are too, but some are not. Some see past the surface to what matters underneath. Kade reached across the table, stopping just short of taking her hand. You deserve a chance, Jane. You deserve to stop running and start living. Jane looked at his hand, so close to hers, and he saw her make a decision. She closed the distance, her fingers brushing his, light as butterfly wings. Why do you care so much? You do not know me. Because I know what it is like to feel like you have to hide who you are to make other people comfortable, Kade said quietly. Because I know what it is like to be judged for something that was not your fault. Because when I look at you, I do not see scars. I see a woman who survived something terrible and kept going anyway. That takes strength, Jane. Real strength. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. When I look at you, I see the same thing. Someone who survived, who kept going. I see someone kind and brave and good. I see someone who could have ridden past that wreckage and chosen not to get involved, but you stopped anyway. That says more about your character than any scar ever could. They sat there in the quiet dining room, hands barely touching, and Kade felt something shift in his chest. It was too soon, too fast, but there it was anyway. The beginning of something that felt an awful lot like hope. He had been alone for so long, drifting from town to town and job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to form real connections. He had told himself it was because he liked his freedom, but the truth was simpler and more painful. He had been hiding just as much as Jane had, using movement and isolation to avoid rejection. I took a job at the saloon, Kade said, pulling his hand back carefully. Bartending and whatever else Pete needs. I figured I would stick around town for a while, make some money before moving on. You are staying. Jane could not quite keep the hope out of her voice. For a while, at least. Kade stood, suddenly needing distance before he said something foolish. Come on. Let me introduce you to Pastor Williams. He is the one who would know about the teaching position. Pastor Williams was a round man with a gentle demeanor and a booming laugh that seemed at odds with his profession. He welcomed them into the small church with genuine warmth, listening as Kade explained the situation. When Jane reluctantly turned to show him her scarred face fully, the pastor's expression did not change. A mountain lion, you said. He leaned closer, examining the scars with clinical interest. Remarkable that you survived. God must have had plans for you, young lady. I used to think so, Jane said softly. Lately, I am not so sure. Faith wavers in difficult times. That is natural and human. Pastor Williams gestured for them to sit in the front pew. Now, about this teaching position. The town desperately needs someone qualified. Our last teacher was adequate but not exceptional, and the children have been running wild for the past month since she left. Can you read and write proficiently? Do you know your mathematics? Yes, sir. I have a certificate from the academy in Denver, and I taught Sunday school at my home church for 3 years before my father died. Jane's voice grew stronger as she spoke about her qualifications. I know Latin and basic Greek, literature, history, geography, and practical mathematics. I also know needlework and can teach basic bookkeeping. "You are overqualified," the pastor said with obvious delight. "The question is whether you would be willing to work in a small town school with limited resources and students of varying ages and abilities all in one room." "I would be willing," Jane said, and Kade could hear the yearning in her voice. "I would be grateful for the opportunity, truly." Pastor Williams stood and offered Jane his hand. "Then welcome to Evanston, Miss Adelaide. The school board will need to formally approve your hiring, but I sit on that board, as does Doc Morrison and Pete from the saloon. I think I can safely say you have the job if you want it. The position comes with a small salary and a room behind the schoolhouse. It is not much, but it is yours." Jane took his hand, shaking it firmly while tears streamed down her face, catching in the ridges of her scars. Thank you so much. You will not regret this, I promise." "I believe you," the pastor said kindly. "Now shall we go look at the schoolhouse? It needs some work, I am afraid." Our last teacher was not particularly invested in maintenance. The schoolhouse was indeed in need of attention. It was a simple wooden building with a dozen desks in various states of repair, a potbelly stove for heat, and shelves of battered books. The room behind the main space was tiny, barely large enough for a bed, a washstand, and a small table, but it had a window that looked out over the desert and let in good light. "It is perfect," Jane said, running her hand over one of the desks. "When can I start?" "Give it a week to get yourself settled and let that shoulder heal," Pastor Williams suggested. "We can spread the word that school will resume Monday next. In the meantime, if you need help cleaning or repairing anything, I am sure folks will be willing to lend a hand." Over the next week, Kade found himself at the schoolhouse every evening after his shift at the saloon, helping Jane scrub floors and repair desks, replace broken window panes, and organize books. They worked side by side in comfortable silence most of the time, occasionally broken by conversation about everything and nothing. He learned that she loved Shakespeare and hated arithmetic, that she could whistle beautifully and could not carry a tune to save her life, that she had always wanted to see the ocean but had never been further than Denver. She learned that he had wanted to be a doctor before his parents died and left him and his brother orphaned at 15, that he had a weakness for apple pie and strong coffee, that he slept poorly and often had nightmares about the bear attack. She learned that he was patient and thorough, that his hands could be gentle despite their size and strength, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. They did not talk about the growing connection between them, the way their hands would brush and linger, the way they found excuses to be near each other. It felt too fragile, too new, like speaking it aloud might shatter whatever was building in the spaces between words. On Sunday, Jane attended church for the first time since arriving in Evanston. She sat near the back, hyper-aware of the way people's eyes caught on her face, the whispers that followed her entrance. But Pastor Williams welcomed her warmly from the pulpit, introducing her as the new schoolteacher, and the whispers shifted from speculation to cautious interest. After the service, several mothers approached her with their children in tow. Most were polite, if somewhat reserved. A few were openly curious about her scars, asking questions that walked the line between concerned and intrusive. Jane handled it all with grace, answering honestly when appropriate and deflecting when necessary. One little girl, no more than 6 with blonde braids and a gap-toothed smile, walked right up to Jane and stared at her face with the blunt curiosity of childhood. "What happened to you?" she asked. "Margaret, that is rude," her mother hissed, pulling the child back. "It is all right," Jane said, kneeling to be at the girl's eye level. "A big cat scratched me when I was younger. It hurt a lot, but I got better." "Does it still hurt?" Margaret asked, reaching out as if to touch the scars before her mother stopped her. Not anymore. Just sometimes when I am very tired. Jane smiled at the girl. What is your favorite subject in school? Reading, Margaret said immediately, but I am not very good at it yet. Well, I love reading too. Maybe we can help each other get better at it. Jane stood, addressing Margaret's mother. I am looking forward to having Margaret in class. The woman's expression softened slightly. We are glad to have a new teacher. The children have been getting into all sorts of trouble without school to occupy them. Kade watched the interaction from across the churchyard, leaning against a post with his arms crossed. He had seen the way Jane handled the questions and stares, the patience and kindness she showed even to people who were less than tactful. He thought about the bitter, frightened woman he had found in the desert just over a week ago, the way she had been so certain that her scars made her worthless. Now here she was, standing tall and meeting challenges head-on, not hiding but not apologizing either. You have got it bad, Pete said, appearing beside him with his usual lack of warning. That look on your face says you are thinking about more than just neighborly concern. I do not know what you are talking about, Kade said, but he did not move his eyes from Jane. Sure you do not. Pete chuckled. For what it is worth, she looks at you the same way when you are not watching. Might want to do something about that before some other fellow gets the same idea. It is too soon. She just got here, just survived a terrible accident. The last thing she needs is me complicating her life. Even as Kade said the words, he knew they were an excuse. He was afraid, plain and simple, afraid that this thing between them was one-sided or temporary, that she would realize she could do better than a drifting bartender with a scarred face and no real prospects. Life is short out here, Pete said seriously. Shorter than most places. You found something good, something real. Do not let fear rob you of it. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and a crisp autumn breeze. Jane woke before dawn, too nervous to sleep, and dressed carefully in her new dress with her hair pinned back neatly. She had decided not to hide her scars, to let the children see them from the start rather than trying to conceal them, and having the reveal be more dramatic later. Kade appeared at her door just as she was preparing to walk to the schoolhouse. Thought you might like some company on your first day, he said, offering his arm. You do not have to do this, Jane said, but she took his arm anyway, grateful for the solid strength of him beside her. I know. I wanted to. They walked through the quiet morning streets together, and when they reached the schoolhouse, a small crowd of children and parents had already gathered. Jane felt her stomach drop, but Kade's hand covered hers briefly, a fleeting touch of reassurance. You have got this, he murmured. Just remember, they need you more than you need them. Jane squared her shoulders and walked forward to meet her students. There were 15 children in total, ranging in age from 5 to 14, all watching her with the frank curiosity of youth. She saw them notice her scars, saw the questions forming, and decided to address it head-on. Good morning, she said, her voice carrying across the yard. My name is Miss Adelaide, and I am your new teacher. You might notice that I have scars on my face. I was attacked by a mountain lion when I was not much older than some of you. It was scary and painful, but I survived, and now I am here. If you have questions about it, you may ask me respectfully, but I will not tolerate rudeness or cruelty about anyone's appearance in my classroom, including mine. We are here to learn and to treat each other with kindness and respect. Is that understood? There was a chorus of yes, Miss Adelaide. And then the parents were saying their goodbyes and Jane was ushering her students inside. Kade lingered for a moment, watching through the window as Jane began taking attendance, her voice clear and confident. He felt pride swell in his chest, warm and unexpected. The first day of school passed in a blur for Jane. She assessed each child's abilities, assigned appropriate readers and mathematics problems, and established the rules and routines that would govern their days together. The children were, for the most part, well-behaved and eager to please their new teacher. Margaret, the little girl from church, attached herself to Jane immediately, asking to help with everything from cleaning the chalkboard to organizing books. By the time Jane dismissed her students at 3 o'clock, she was exhausted but exhilarated. She had done it. She had stood in front of a classroom full of children and their families and taught, and no one had run screaming or demanded she be fired. It was more than she had dared to hope for. Kade was waiting outside when she emerged, leaning against the fence with his hat tilted to shade his face from the afternoon sun. He straightened when he saw her, and the smile that crossed his scarred face made her heart stutter in her chest. "How did it go?" he asked. "It was wonderful," Jane said, and she could hear the wonder in her own voice. "They were wonderful. A few of the older boys tested boundaries, but that is to be expected. Margaret wants to help me with everything, which is adorable and slightly exhausting." The parents who came to pick up their children seemed pleased. She stopped, looking at him directly. "Thank you, for everything, for finding me, for bringing me here, for believing I could do this when I did not believe it myself." "You did this," Kade said firmly. "I just pointed you in the right direction. The rest was all you." They started walking together, not toward Jane's room at the schoolhouse or the hotel or the saloon, just walking through town as the afternoon light turned everything golden. Jane found herself talking about her day in detail, about the children's personalities and the challenges she anticipated, about her plans for lessons and projects. Kade listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering observations that showed he had been paying attention. "I was thinking," Jane said as they reached the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land, "that I would like to start a lending library. Nothing fancy, just a shelf where people could borrow books. So many families out here do not have access to reading material beyond the Bible and maybe a catalog." "That is a good idea," Kade said. "I could build you some shelves if you like. I am decent with woodwork." "You do not have to do that. You have already done so much." Kade stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Jane, I keep doing these things because I want to, not because I feel obligated. I keep finding excuses to be around you because I enjoy your company. I think about you when I am not with you. I look forward to seeing you every day. At some point, you are going to have to accept that maybe, just maybe, I am doing all of this because I care about you, not because I pity you or feel responsible for you." Jane's breath caught in her throat. "Kade, I cannot ask you to care about me. I am damaged goods and you could have any woman you wanted if you would just let yourself try." "I do not want any woman," Kade said, stepping closer. "I want you. Your strength, your kindness, your laugh, your sharp mind. I want the way you see the world, the way you do not give up even when things are hard. I want the woman who survived a mountain lion and a stagecoach crash and standing in front of a room full of strangers and did it all with grace and courage." "I am scared," Jane whispered. "I am scared that this is too good to be real, that I am going to wake up and find it was all a dream. I am scared that you are going to realize I am not worth the trouble." "Then we match perfectly," Kade said, echoing his words from that first night. "Because I am scared too. I am scared that you are going to realize you can do better than a bartender with no real home and a face that makes children flinch. I am scared that this thing between us is moving too fast, that we should slow down and be sensible. But I am more scared of letting you go without telling you how I feel." Jane looked up at him, at his scarred face and steady eyes, at the man who had saved her life, and then helped her build a new one. She thought about all the years she had spent hiding, all the opportunities she had let pass by because she was too afraid of rejection. She thought about Pete's words, "Life is short out here." "I care about you too," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I think about you constantly. I find excuses to need your help just so I can spend time with you. When you smile at me, I feel like I can do anything. You make me feel seen, really seen for the first time in years. Not pitied or avoided or grudgingly tolerated, but seen and valued and wanted." Kade reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her scarred cheek in his hand. His touch was gentle, reverent, tracing the raised lines of tissue with his thumb. "You are so beautiful," he said softly. "Every part of you." "So are you," Jane whispered. And then she was rising on her toes and he was leaning down, and their lips met in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. They stood there as the sun set over the Arizona desert, two scarred survivors finding hope and healing in each other. And for the first time in years, neither of them felt the need to hide. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Jane threw herself into teaching with a passion that surprised even her, developing lesson plans that challenged her students while making learning engaging and fun. She started the lending library with donations from families around town, and a beautiful set of shelves that Kade built and installed on a Saturday afternoon. She organized a spelling bee and a recitation competition, events that brought the whole town out to watch their children perform. Kade continued working at the saloon, saving his money with a purpose now, a future he could see taking shape. He spent his free time with Jane, walking with her after school, sharing meals, talking about everything and nothing. They moved slowly, both aware that what they were building was too important to rush, but the connection between them deepened with each passing day. They got to know each other in the small, mundane ways that mattered. Kade learned that Jane hummed when she was concentrating, that she had a fierce, competitive streak when it came to checkers, that she was afraid of thunderstorms but too proud to admit it. Jane learned that Kade was an early riser who greeted each dawn like a gift, that he had a soft spot for stray animals and often brought scraps from the saloon to feed the town's dogs, that he could be stubborn when he thought he was right, but would listen to reason if presented with good arguments. The town accepted them as a couple without much fuss, perhaps because they were both outsiders in a way, both marked by their pasts but determined to build futures. The children in Jane's class adored her, responding to her patience and genuine interest in their well-being. Even the parents who had been skeptical at first came around when they saw how much their children were learning and growing under her guidance. 2 months after Jane started teaching, winter began to settle over Arizona in earnest. The days were still warm, but the nights grew cold, and frost sometimes glittered on the windows in the morning. Jane had been feeling unwell for a few days, a persistent dizziness and nausea that she attributed to working too hard and not eating enough. Doc Morrison disagreed when she finally consulted him after nearly fainting in front of her class. "You are not sick, Miss Adelaide," he said with a knowing smile. "You are pregnant." Jane sat down hard on the examination table, her mind reeling. "That is not possible. I have not. Kade and I have not." "Are you certain about that?" Doc Morrison asked gently. "Because your body is telling me otherwise. About 2 months along, I would say." Jane's mind raced back, and then she remembered. That night 3 weeks after she started teaching, when Kade had walked her home and they had stood outside the schoolhouse talking. The conversation had turned serious, emotional, and they had gone inside to continue it in private. One thing had led to another, passion overcoming caution, and they had made love for the first time in her small bed with moonlight streaming through the window. They had both known it was probably foolish, but in that moment, It had felt right and necessary and inevitable. They had not spoken about it afterward, both somewhat embarrassed by the intensity of what they had shared, but the intimacy had changed things between them, deepening their connection even further. "Oh God," Jane whispered, pressing her hands to her stomach. "What am I going to do?" "I will lose my job. Unwed mothers cannot teach school." "That is true," Doc Morrison said carefully. "Unless you were to marry before anyone notices. You are not showing yet, and if you are careful with your clothing, you could probably hide it for another month or two." "Kade has not asked me to marry him," Jane said, feeling panic rise in her chest. "What if he does not want this? What if he feels trapped?" "Only one way to find out," the doctor said pragmatically. "Talk to the man." Jane walked to the saloon in a daze, her mind spinning with fear and hope and 1,000 what-ifs. It was mid-afternoon, and the saloon was quiet, just a few regulars nursing drinks. Kade was behind the bar, polishing glasses, and his face lit up when he saw her. "Jane, this is a surprise. You are not usually here during the day." His smile faded as he took in her expression. "What is wrong? Are you ill? Can we talk? Privately?" Jane's voice came out thin and shaky. Kade's concern deepened, but he nodded and called to Pete that he was taking a break. He led Jane outside and around to the back of the building where they could not be overheard. "You are scaring me. What happened?" "I am pregnant," Jane said, the words blurting out before she could think of a gentler way to say them. Doc Morrison confirmed it. "About 2 months along, which means it happened that night, the first night we were together." She watched Kade's face carefully, trying to read his reaction. He looked shocked, certainly, but as the news sank in, something else crossed his features. Wonder, maybe, or joy, or both. "A baby," he said softly. "We are going to have a baby. I am going to have a baby," Jane corrected, tears starting to fall. "You do not have to be involved if you do not want to be. I will leave town, find work somewhere else. I will not trap you into anything." "Trap me?" Kade looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Jane, I love you. I have been trying to work up the courage to propose for weeks now, trying to save enough money for a ring and a proper place for us to live. A baby just moves up the timeline." "You love me." Jane's voice was barely a whisper. "Of course I love you. How could you not know?" Kade took her hands in his. "I love the way you throw yourself into everything you do. I love your stubbornness and your kindness and the way you sing to yourself when you think no one is listening, even though you cannot carry a tune. I love waking up in the morning knowing I am going to see you. I love falling asleep thinking about our conversations. I love everything about you, Jane, and I would be honored if you would marry me." "You want to marry me?" Jane was crying in earnest now. "Even though I am pregnant and going to lose my job and ruin both our reputations. You will not lose your job if we get married quickly. As for reputations, mine was never that great to begin with." Kade smiled at her, that crooked smile that made her heart race. "Marry me, Jane. Let me be your husband and the father to our child. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that you are the best thing that ever happened to me." "Yes," Jane said, launching herself into his arms. "Yes, I will marry you. I love you too. I have loved you almost from the beginning, but I was too scared to say it." They held each other in the alley behind the saloon, two scarred survivors who had found love in the most unexpected of places and made plans for their future. They would marry as soon as possible, quietly to avoid too much speculation. Kade would talk to Pete about moving into the small house behind the saloon that had been sitting empty, and they would make it a home. Jane would keep teaching as long as she could, and then they would figure out what came next together. Pastor Williams married them 3 days later in a simple ceremony attended by Doc Morrison, Pete, Clara, and a handful of friends they had made in town. Jane wore a new dress that Clara had helped her sew, pale yellow with lace at the collar and cuffs. Kade wore his best shirt and pants, his hair freshly cut and his boots polished. When they exchanged vows, their voices were steady and sure, and when Kade kissed his bride, there was not a dry eye in the church. The house behind the saloon was small but sturdy, with 2 rooms and a covered porch that looked out over the desert. It needed work, which they tackled together over the following weeks. Kade repaired the roof and replaced broken floorboards while Jane scrubbed walls and windows until they gleamed. They furnished it slowly, buying or bartering for what they needed. A bed, a table and chairs, a cookstove, curtains for the windows. Jane kept teaching through the winter, and if anyone noticed that her dresses were getting looser and she was avoiding tight corsets, they were polite enough not to mention it. She finally had to tell her students in early spring, when she could no longer hide her condition. "I am going to have a baby," she announced one morning, watching their faces carefully. "This means I will need to take some time away from teaching when the baby comes, but I promise I will return as soon as I am able." The children erupted in excited chatter, asking when the baby would arrive and whether it would be a boy or a girl, and could they help take care of it. Margaret, now 7 and reading at a level far beyond her years, declared that she would be the baby's special helper. Jane felt her heart swell with affection for these children who had accepted her so completely, who saw past her scars to the teacher who loved them. The baby came in late May, arriving in the early morning hours after a long night of labor. Doc Morrison and Clara attended the birth while Kade paced the porch outside, too nervous to sit still. When Clara finally emerged to tell him he had a son, he nearly fell over with relief and joy. Jane was exhausted but glowing when he entered the bedroom, their tiny son wrapped in a blanket and cradled against her chest. "Meet Samuel," she said softly. "Samuel Quinlan. He is perfect, Kade. Absolutely perfect." Kade approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at his son. Samuel was indeed perfect, with a downy covering of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. When Kade carefully took him in his arms, the baby's eyes opened, dark and unfocused, and Kade felt his heart crack open with a love so fierce, it nearly brought him to his knees. "Hello, Samuel," he whispered. "I am your papa. I promise I am going to do everything I can to keep you safe and happy and loved." Jane watched her husband hold their son, watched the tenderness in his scarred face, and felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible. Just 9 months ago, she had been alone and terrified in the desert, convinced her life was over. Now she had a home, a husband, a child, and a purpose. She had found acceptance and love in this small Arizona town, had built a life she was proud of. Over the next few months, Jane recovered from childbirth and gradually returned to teaching, bringing Samuel with her to school when he was small enough to sleep peacefully in a basket beside her desk. The children were fascinated by the baby, and Jane used their interest to teach lessons on child development, family responsibilities, and gentle caregiving. Kade thrived in his role as father and husband, though he continued working at the saloon to support his family. He was endlessly patient with Samuel, walking the floor with him during sleepless nights, changing diapers without complaint, singing off key lullabies that somehow always worked. Jane would sometimes wake in the night to find Kade sitting by the window with Samuel in his arms, just watching their son sleep with an expression of wonder on his face. "I never thought I would have this," he told her one of those nights when he realized she was awake. "A family, a home, someone who loves me despite all my rough edges and scars. You gave me that, Jane. You and Samuel." "You gave me the same," Jane said, joining him at the window and resting her head on his shoulder. You saw me when I felt invisible. You believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable. Then we match perfectly, Kade said, repeating the words that had become their private refrain, and kissed her temple gently. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the Quinlan family became a fixture in Evanston. Jane's school continued to thrive, with parents requesting her specifically for their children. She developed a reputation as a fair but demanding teacher who genuinely cared about her students' success. Kade eventually left the saloon to work full-time as a carpenter, his skill with woodwork becoming well known throughout the region. He built furniture for families, repaired buildings, and even designed and constructed a new church bell tower that became a point of pride for the town. They had 2 more children over the next 4 years. A daughter named Catherine, who inherited her father's steady temperament and her mother's love of reading, and another son named Thomas, who was adventurous and wild from the moment he could walk. Their house behind the saloon grew too small, so Kade built them a new one on the edge of town with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Jane's students grew and graduated, going on to become teachers and merchants and ranchers themselves. Margaret, who had been that gap-toothed 6-year-old in Jane's first class, eventually became a teacher herself, returning to Evanston to teach alongside the woman who had inspired her. The lending library Jane had started grew into an actual town library, housed in its own building with Jane serving on the board of directors. Through it all, Jane and Kade's love for each other deepened and matured. They had arguments, of course, moments of frustration and miscommunication, but they always came back to each other with apologies and renewed understanding. They learned each other's rhythms and needs, when to push and when to give space, how to be partners in the truest sense of the word. On their 10th anniversary, Kade took Jane on a trip to California, fulfilling her long-held dream of seeing the ocean. They left their children with Clara, who had become like a grandmother to the Quinlan brood, and spent a week in San Diego walking on beaches and exploring tide pools. Jane stood with her feet in the surf, her face turned to the sun, and thought about how far she had come from that terrified woman bleeding in the desert. "What are you thinking about?" Kade asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "About second chances," Jane said, leaning back against him. "About how the worst day of my life led to the best days of my life. About how grateful I am that you found me." "I am grateful too," Kade said. "For you, for our family, for every day I get to wake up beside you. You saved me just as surely as I saved you, Jane. You gave me a reason to stop drifting and start living." They stood together as waves crashed around their ankles and seabirds called overhead. 2 people who had been broken and scarred and had found wholeness in each other. Their scars were still visible, would always be visible, but they had long since stopped seeing them as marks of shame. They were reminders of survival, of strength, of the moment when their paths had crossed and their lives had changed forever. When they returned to Evanston, their children ran to greet them with shouts of joy and endless questions about the ocean. Samuel, now 10 and already tall for his age, wanted to know everything about the ships in the harbor. Catherine, 6 and precocious, demanded to know what shells sounded like when you held them to your ear. Thomas, 4 and exhausting, just wanted to be picked up and held. Kade scooped up Thomas while Jane hugged Samuel and Catherine, and together they walked back to their house, a family complete and content. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Jane and Kade sat on their porch and watched the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if that stagecoach had not crashed?" Kade asked. "Sometimes," Jane admitted. I think about the path I was on, trying to hide who I was, trying to make myself invisible. I probably would have spent my whole life feeling ashamed and alone, teaching but never really connecting with anyone. She took his hand. I am grateful that fate intervened, that it brought me to you. Even though people died and it was terrible, something good came from it. Is that wrong to think? No, Kade said firmly. It is not wrong to acknowledge that beauty can come from tragedy, that redemption can grow from pain. We honor those who died by living well, by loving each other and our children, by building something meaningful with the second chance we were given. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands clasped, listening to the desert night sounds they had both come to love. An owl hooted in the distance. A coyote called and was answered by another. The wind whispered through the sage and mesquite, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. I want to tell you something, Jane said eventually. I am pregnant again. Kade turned to her with surprise and delight. Again, are you sure? Doc Morrison confirmed it yesterday, due in late winter, probably February. Jane smiled at him. I know we said 3 was enough, but apparently fate had other plans. Fate has excellent plans, Kade said, pulling her close and kissing her soundly. Another child to love and raise and watch grow. How did I get so lucky? We got lucky together, Jane corrected. 2 scarred survivors who found each other against all odds. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in early February of 1887, Jane gave birth to another daughter, whom they named Lucy after Jane's mother. She was a small baby but healthy and strong, with a surprisingly loud cry that kept the household awake for the first few months. Samuel and Catherine were old enough to be helpful, entertaining their little sister and assisting with small tasks. Thomas was mostly just confused about why the baby could not play with him yet. As Lucy grew, the Quinlan family adapted to include her, their routines shifting to accommodate a 4th child. Jane reduced her teaching schedule, working only 3 days a week and training a young woman named Helen to take over the other 2 days. She wanted more time with her growing family, wanted to be present for the small moments that passed too quickly. Kade continued his carpentry work, taking on bigger projects as his reputation spread. He built homes and barns, designed furniture for wealthy families in Tucson, and even worked on a hotel in Phoenix. The money was good, allowing them to live comfortably and save for their children's futures. Years passed in the way they do for happy families, marked by small triumphs and occasional challenges. Samuel developed a passion for astronomy and spent hours studying the night sky, eventually leaving for university in California to study science. Catherine became a gifted writer, her stories published in regional newspapers and magazines. Thomas followed in his father's footsteps, learning carpentry and proving to have an even better eye for design. Lucy, the baby, grew into a fierce and independent girl who declared at age 8 that she wanted to be a doctor. And no one doubted she would achieve it. Jane continued teaching into her 40s, finally retiring when her oldest students began bringing their own children to her classroom. She spent her retirement writing curriculum and training new teachers, sharing the methods and approaches she had developed over decades of experience. She also wrote a memoir, detailing her journey from scarred and ashamed survivor to respected teacher and beloved wife and mother. The book sold moderately well and earned her speaking invitations throughout Arizona and New Mexico. Kade remained active and healthy well into his 50s, though he eventually handed over the daily running of his carpentry business to Thomas. He took up painting in his spare time, discovering a talent for capturing the beauty of the desert landscape. His paintings adorned the walls of their home and were given as gifts to friends and family. Their scars faded with time, becoming just another part of their faces rather than the defining features they once were. People who met them now saw them as a couple who had clearly weathered life together, who moved in sync after decades of partnership, who looked at each other with the kind of deep affection that only comes from truly knowing and being known by another person. On a warm spring evening in 1898, Jane and Kade sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. They were in their 50s now, their children grown and building their own lives, their grandchildren beginning to arrive. Samuel had married and worked as an astronomer in California. Catherine lived in Denver with her journalist husband and their 2 children. Thomas and his wife lived in Evanston with their infant son, running the carpentry business. Lucy was in medical school in Chicago, one of only a handful of women in her class. "We did well," Jane said, resting her head on Kade's shoulder. "Our children are happy and successful and good people." "They got that from you," Kade said, kissing the top of her head. "Your strength, your determination, your kindness. They got plenty from you too," Jane argued. "Your steadiness, your work ethic, your gentle heart." "Then they got the best of both of us," Kade said with satisfaction. They watched the last light fade from the sky, watched the first stars appear, and Jane thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 22 years since that terrible day in the desert when she had been so certain her life was over. 22 years of love and partnership, of building a family and a life together, of learning that scars did not define them but refine them. "Kade," she said softly. "Yes, love. Thank you for everything, for finding me, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful life." "Thank you for letting me," Kade said, "for trusting me when you had every reason not to, for loving me back, for being my partner in everything." "Then we match perfectly," Jane said, smiling as she repeated the words that had become their promise to each other, and Kade laughed, the sound warm and full of joy. "Yes," he agreed. "Yes, we do." They sat together as the desert night deepened around them, holding hands the way they had for more than 2 decades. 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a love that had weathered every storm. Their scars were still visible if you knew to look for them, but they no longer carried shame or pain. They were simply part of the story, part of the journey that had led to this porch, this moment, this life lived fully and well. In the house behind them, Thomas was putting his son to bed, singing the same off-key lullabies Kade had sung to him years ago. In California and Denver and Chicago, their other children were living their own lives, carrying forward the lessons Jane and Kade had taught them about love and resilience, and the importance of seeing past surface appearances to the truth underneath. The world had changed enormously since that day in 1876, when Jane's stagecoach had crashed, and Kade had found her bleeding in the desert. The Wild West was becoming less wild. Towns were growing into cities, railroads were connecting distant places, and new technologies were transforming daily life. But some things remained constant: the need for human connection, the power of love to heal and transform, the truth that scars told stories worth hearing. Jane and Kade had lived those truths every day of their marriage. They had built a family on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding, had created a home filled with love and laughter, had shown their children and their community that differences in appearance meant nothing compared to content of character. They had proven, to themselves and to anyone watching, that broken things could be mended, that scared hearts could learn to trust, that love could bloom in the most unexpected places. As the years continued to pass, they aged together with grace and humor, supporting each other through the inevitable losses and challenges that came with growing older. When Jane's eyesight began to fail, Cade read to her every evening, his voice bringing to life the stories she loved. When Cade developed arthritis in his hands, Jane massaged them gently, easing the pain and stiffness. They learned to lean on each other more heavily, literally and figuratively, and found that the love they had built was more than strong enough to carry them. Their grandchildren grew and multiplied, filling their home with noise and joy during visits. They told stories of the old days, of teaching and carpentry and building a life in a small Arizona town. They shared the story of how they met, of Jane's scars and Cade's kindness, of the moment they had looked at each other and recognized a kindred spirit. The grandchildren loved the story, the romance and drama of it, and Jane and Cade told it willingly, never tiring of remembering those early days. On their 30th anniversary, their children organized a celebration in Evanston, gathering friends and family from near and far. The town had changed over the decades, growing larger and more modern, but many of the old-timers remained, people who remembered when Jane had first arrived broken and bleeding, when Cade had been a lonely bartender with sad eyes. They remembered the wedding, the births of the children, the way the Quinlans had become part of the fabric of the community. Pastor Williams, now elderly himself, stood to offer a toast. "I have had the privilege of knowing Jane and Kade Quinlan for 30 years, he said, his voice still strong despite his age. I have watched them build a marriage that serves as an example to us all. They have shown us that love is not about perfection, but about acceptance, not about hiding our flaws, but about finding someone who sees them and loves us anyway. They have shown us that scars, whether physical or emotional, are not things to be ashamed of but badges of survival, proof that we endured and kept going. To Jane and Cade, may you have many more years together." The gathered crowd raised their glasses and echoed the sentiment, and Jane felt tears prick her eyes. She looked around at the faces of everyone she loved, at the life she and Cade had built together, and felt overwhelming gratitude. How close she had come to missing all of this, to letting shame and fear rob her of the chance at happiness. How fortunate she was that fate had intervened, that Cade had found her, that they had been brave enough to trust each other and build something beautiful together. Cade squeezed her hand under the table, and when she looked at him, she saw her own emotions reflected in his eyes. Love, gratitude, joy, and a touch of amazement that they had been lucky enough to find each other. He leaned close and whispered in her ear, "Then we match perfectly," and she laughed through her tears and kissed him in front of everyone. The celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling. Jane danced with Cade, their movements slower than they once were, but no less heartfelt. She danced with her sons and sons-in-law, with her grandchildren who stepped carefully on her feet and giggled. She watched Cade do the same, his face alight with happiness, and thought about how this was what it all came down to in the end. Love and family and connection, the ties that bound people together and made life worth living. As they grew older still, Jane and Cade's world gradually contracted. They gave up their large house and moved into a smaller one in town, closer to Thomas and his growing family. They spent their days in simple pleasures, reading, talking, sitting together in comfortable silence. Their bodies might have been slowing down, but their minds remained sharp, and their love for each other continued to grow, deepening into something that transcended words or physical expression. Jane developed a weak heart in her late 60s, and Doc Morrison's successor warned that her time was likely limited. She accepted the news with equanimity, having lived a full and satisfying life beyond anything she had once imagined possible. She worried more about Cade, about leaving him alone after so many years together. "Promise me you will be all right," she said one quiet evening as they sat together in their small parlor. "Promise me you will not give up when I am gone." "Jane, do not talk like that," Kade said, but his voice was thick with emotion. "We have to talk about it eventually," Jane said gently. "I am not afraid of dying, Kade. I have lived a wonderful life, loved and been loved, raised 4 beautiful children, taught hundreds of students. I have no regrets except that I will have to leave you." Kade took her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "You gave me everything," he said roughly. "Every good thing in my life came from you, from that day I found you in the desert. You turned me from a drifter into a man with purpose and meaning. You gave me a family, a home, a reason to wake up every morning with hope in my heart. And you gave me the same," Jane said, tears sliding down her scarred cheeks. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable, believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself. You gave me permission to stop hiding and start living. Every happy moment of the past 35 years has been a gift you helped give me." They held each other as the evening light faded, 2 old people who had been young together, who had built a life from nothing, who had loved each other through everything. There were no more words needed, nothing left unsaid after decades of honest communication and deep connection. They simply existed together, breathing in sync, hearts beating in rhythm, perfectly matched. Jane passed away peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning in 1904, with Kade holding her hand. She was 70 years old and had lived to see her children successful and happy, her grandchildren thriving, and her great-grandchildren beginning to arrive. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched: former students, fellow teachers, friends, neighbors, and family. They spoke of her kindness and wisdom, her dedication to education and her community, the way she had never let her scars define her, but had instead used her experience to teach others about resilience and acceptance. Kade grieved deeply, but not destructively. He had his children and grandchildren surrounding him with love and support, and he knew Jane would have wanted him to keep living rather than simply existing. He continued his painting, creating a series of portraits of Jane from memory, capturing her at different ages and stages of their life together. He spent time with his family, telling stories of their mother and grandmother, keeping her memory alive. 2 years after Jane's death, Kade passed away quietly in his sleep. He was 75 years old and, according to his children, had never really recovered from losing his beloved wife. They buried him beside Jane in the Evanston Cemetery, under a simple headstone that read, "Kade and Jane Quinlan, together forever, perfectly matched." Their legacy lived on in their descendants, who spread across the West and beyond, carrying forward the lessons of love and acceptance their grandparents had embodied. Samuel's grandson became a famous astronomer who discovered a new comet. Catherine's great-granddaughter wrote a novel based on Jane and Kade's story that became a bestseller. Thomas's carpentry business continued for 3 more generations, building homes throughout Arizona. Lucy became a renowned surgeon and taught at medical schools, inspiring other women to pursue medicine. But perhaps their greatest legacy was simpler and more profound. They had shown that scars, whether physical or emotional, did not have to be sources of shame. They had proven that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that 2 broken people could make each other whole, that matching perfectly was not about being flawless, but about finding someone who saw your flaws and loved you because of them, not despite them. In Evanston, their story became legend, told and retold to new generations. The house Kade had built still stood, preserved as a historical landmark. The school where Jane had taught for so many years bore a plaque in her honor. Their paintings and writings were archived in the local museum. But more than any physical monument, they lived on in the hearts and memories of everyone whose lives they had touched, proof that one moment of kindness, one decision to stop and help a stranger in distress, could change everything. And so the story of the scarred cowboy and the scarred teacher, of two people who found each other in the Arizona desert and built a love that lasted a lifetime, passed into history and folklore, inspiring others to look past surface appearances to the truth underneath, to take chances on love even when fear urged caution, to believe that happy endings were possible even for those who had been broken and scarred by life. They had indeed matched perfectly, those two survivors, and in their matching had created something beautiful and enduring that would never be forgotten.